So we want to end our episode with Ezekiel and looking at Ezekiel and his ministry and what he does. Now, Ezekiel is interesting because Ezekiel, his prophecy, there's a lot of imagery. And one of the things that's fascinating is Ezekiel is in captivity when he's really commissioned by God. And his commissioning looks a lot like being set aside and anointed for priesthood. But the problem is that Ezekiel is being set aside and anointed for priesthood when the temple is back in Jerusalem. It seems to me that what God is trying to emphasize with his people is that they have a different view of the temple than God has. How might their view of the temple and God's view of the temple differ?
So obviously they valued the physical temple, and we can see in 70 AD at the destruction of the temple how kind of that view of the temple, how warped it kind of was, and the value they placed on it. And obviously as New Testament Christians, we realize that we as the church are the temple,
Right.
And so for Ezekiel to be a priest to these people who have no temple, it kind of has to show them that the temple is something a little different than what you think it is.
Right. And one of the things that happens with Ezekiel is he does a number of, he's commanded by God to live in a very strange way, or to do a number of strange things in as far as his public ministry, we'll say. And one of them is that he builds a model of Jerusalem and then destroys it. And then he has to shave his head, and then he ends up lying on his side for like a year and eats food that's been cooked over dung, which I'm sure there was like you want me to do what now, God? But why does God have Ezekiel do these things?
He's essentially given Israel a picture of the judgment that's coming if they aren't brought to repentance, and here Ezekiel is modeling it for them.
Yeah, and that modeling is interesting. Ezekiel has to embody some of the things that are happening, and so if you're laying on your side and eating dung, what is the purpose of the embodiment of some of these things? Because you wonder about, like, is God just having fun with Ezekiel? Is he saying, hey, now look what I'm going to have you do?
Well, we could talk about eating and incorporation, and there's definitely some imagery there, but also just, you're going to be, they were definitely not supposed to be eating dung, and there's definitely some cleanliness, kosher laws they're violating in the process, but it just says, what's coming is you're going to be bathed in filth, in complete uncleanness, if you continue down this road.
Right. And it's fascinating to me that one of the aspects of being a prophet is that there are certain things that you have to embody, and whether Ezekiel likes it or not, my guess is he doesn't. He's got to embody this, and there's a certain level of sacrifice that's necessary on the part of the prophet. Now, why is God? Because I think all of us think to ourselves, well, wouldn't it be great if I knew the future? Wouldn't it be great? But there's a certain amount of sacrifice that takes place in all of the different lives of the prophets. And so why does God call his servants to do this? I mean, there's that old, I can't remember who it was that said, that after falling down, God, if this is how you treat your friends, there's no wonder you have so few of them. There's a little bit of that going on here.
Yeah, I think that might have been a Mother Teresa quote referring to Paul or something like that, is how I've heard it, but that could be just lore. But yeah, no, I will say it does seem like there's a fairly extreme lack of fairness in this. However, this didn't end with the prophets, right? I mean, how many Christian martyrs have there been? And the truth is, every single Christian is called to sacrifice at some point in their life, and in a variety of ways. And I think it's we've talked about love is displayed no better than when there's sacrifice involved. And I think in some measure it shows their love for God, but also God's love for his people.
Yeah, I think God is calling on them to be a microcosm, because one of the things that's really fascinating about The visions that Ezekiel has is that he sees the glory of God leaving the temple, and he also, at the very beginning of his calling, he sees the glory of God manifesting itself in a vision that he has while he's in Babylon. And one of the great questions would have to be, well, why am I seeing a vision of God's glory here in Babylon? But then he kind of gets the answer to that when he sees a vision of the glory of God leaving the temple. Now, the glory of God leaves the temple because of the idolatry of the leadership and the people of Israel. And so what is Ezekiel really seeing in these visions about the character and nature of God? Why would God be leaving the temple, and why does he show up in Babylon?
Obviously, he leaves the temple, and as you pointed out, it's attributed directly to the leadership that's there, and essentially Ezekiel gets some secret knowledge of some of the idolatry going on by specific leaders. I think they're even mentioned by name, and then also obviously going to Babylon from there, where the majority of the people are at that point. Just shows that God still looks at them and views them as his people.
Yeah, and so one of the fascinating things you have is both a clarification of what the temple really is, that the temple is the people. And so when God has gone out of the hearts of the people, God has left the temple. But then there's also this picture that you have of God saying, well, I will go into exile with you. And because there is a remnant, God is now kind of in exile. And so the reason that the prophet has to go through the suffering of the people and embody that is because he's a microcosm of God going through suffering with his people. And it really shows us a different side of exile and a different side of what's really happening when God brings judgment on his people. What do you think then the message that we should take as Christians is from this episode with Ezekiel?
I think we should be reminded that, just as it says in Hebrews, that God chastens those whom he loves. And sometimes judgment comes upon us, and it's always for our good. In the same way that we discipline our children, it's not pleasant to discipline your children. There's some suffering as a parent in disciplining your children, and in the same way, I think God sees it the same way. I think too often we're just like, God's angry and that's it,
Yeah.
and not seeing the love that kind of envelops all of it.